this is a legend here. So as you can see, the situation is rather difficult for both sides. When we look at the number of the casualties, these are none of them are final, of course. These are official numbers from the Ukrainian side. The number of soldiers is 1,300. Civilians, which are again official numbers, UN numbers. Refugees who fled from Ukraine is 2.7 million. Most of them went to Poland. From the Russian side, if you look at the website of Russia's defense ministry, it's only 50. But according to different estimations, the number is much higher in both sides. This is just, and also the objectives of the Russian military operation, just to remind us what were declared on February 24th. These three objectives, big objectives: protecting the people in the eastern part of Ukraine, demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, bringing to justice. And it's interesting also during the discussion how many of those objectives have been achieved so far. If Russia is very careful to follow all these objectives and achieving these objectives. So in order to discuss these and other questions, I'm going to ask Aspet. And before you go into the Armenian context, Aspet, would you please tell us how do you see this conflict in the global and particularly the European context? In what ways has the conflict impacted the security, economy, and social order of Europe and the post-Soviet space? And are there any observations that we can make at this point in time?
Thank you very much, Vadim. As anyone, any scholar who is actually observing this, you cannot make major statements because there are a lot of unknowns, right? It's just like an iceberg. We only see the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's happening, let alone about the causes and the consequences and the decisions to go to start the war. Couple of things, quick comments about this. First of all, I think what we're seeing is the dismantling of the international system. It's unraveling in front of our eyes. I wouldn't call it broken. We'll talk about this down the line. But the security component, as rightfully you mentioned, Vadim, is not just about drone security. You have the military security, obviously. You do have a human security component. You have energy security, food security, climate security. Yes, at times like these, we don't think about any of these, but there is a major sort of unraveling, if you want to call it, of developments in terms of all these domains. Europe, interestingly and not surprisingly, has banded together. They've actually, you would see probably one of the first instances where all EU members, all NATO members, without any reservations, have actually closed ranks. I was actually surprised to even see, for instance, Hungary's Viktor Orban, closing ranks with the EU and so on. Because this has become a major sort of challenge of existing security, existing order. Europe, we're seeing a lot of sentiments. Luckily, policy is not determined by sentiments. One of the latest discussions has also been about countries that are not members of NATO, like Sweden, for instance, whether or not they're going to join NATO or not. There's a popular sentiment but usually decisions like that. So within all this context, what we're seeing is a functionality of EU and NATO increasing and making it more relevant than ever before. We're seeing energy security raising major problems. And it's always easy to talk about things in hindsight, right? Yeah, you look at dates and whatnot, and yes, I knew that this was going to happen. I'm not going to claim that, but in hindsight, knowing what happened now, it was quite interesting, for instance, in early February, that Russia and China signed a multi-billion and many, multi-layered sort of agreements about gas. So energy security, Russia's was already putting in place its alternative for gas and energy export. The problem here is how is, if at all, Europe is going to be able to subsidize the import from the energy import from Russia. Just for you to just a couple of numbers, you don't need to remember these and so on, but countries like Germany depend 65% on Russian gas, okay? Countries like Bulgaria, right, 100% on gas, and 60% of the refined oil that is used in Bulgaria comes from Lukoil refinery, another Russian oil company. Poland, Italy, they own 40, they rely 45% of their energy on Russia. Now you're talking about sanctions. This is truly a global level sanction. Some countries are walking a very thin line. We'll talk about that in a moment. But even when it comes to the food security, about a third of the global cereal market comes from Ukraine and Russia combined. Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh, Iran, these are multi-million, population countries. They rely solely on Russian and Ukrainian wheat. Other countries like Libya, Pakistan, Tunisia, they rely overwhelmingly on Russian wheat. Sunflower seed, 75% of the world's global sunflower seed comes from Ukraine and Russia combined. If you're thinking about sanctions and the loss of production, the impact is huge. And the economic component, this is where actually the security component is in flux, but the economic and social component, the social component, I think might be the least one that Europe is going to be affected. As limited as it was with their experience with Syrian refugees, Europe is in a way in position to handle that. But the economic component is going to be the biggest challenge for Europe to adjust. There are already discussions about where to find alternative sources. Norway would export more energy, more oil to the European Union. Interestingly, I'm seeing also chatter about Iran and Venezuela, coming out of their blacklists, the US and the Western blacklist. And some people might argue, yeah, yesterday Iran just fired rockets in northern Iraq in some American sort of targets and so on. While yes, you might think that, okay, that means that there's no deal, but I might even say that because there are no black or white, there's no black or white in international relations, this might be also the last salvo for Iran to show, right, like we bombed the hell out of them, and even with that, we're signing an agreement with them, they're going to lift the sanctions. So in all of this, one thing is clear, the West is united. Even surprisingly, countries that are 100% dependent on Russian oil and gas. But the question is for how long? I think the main question is the length, the temporal component of this conflict. How long will it get, and who's going to be able to bleed longer? It will eventually come down to a war of attrition.
Thank you, Aspat. Thank you very much. Uroš, my second question is for you. So both Serbia and Armenia took positions which were somehow different from the mainstream views and condemnations of Russia. Would you please help us understand the key drivers behind Serbia's position on this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, Serbia's position is quite precarious in this proxy war, if you will, right? Serbia is not a part of the European Union. Serbia is officially militarily neutral. Serbia's position for a long time has been one of, if you will, neutrality, but also a theory, what we call of silence, which has been championed through the early 2000s, been part of our foreign policy, is that in great power politics, Serbia will not have a clear position. Serbia's position is rather complicated. On the one hand, it has extremely close ties with Russia. They are mostly cultural and historic from the First World War onwards. And this type of relationship has been strengthened in the 1990s when Russia was quite a strong ally and supporter of Serbia, especially with the unfortunate events in Kosovo that we saw with the breakaway region that's declared self-independence in 2008. Russia has been a staunch supporter of Serbia in not recognizing Kosovo's independence. So Serbia needs Russia's support as a UN veto member. It needs Russian support in order to keep its territorial integrity. So on the one hand, you have Serbia's interest in an alliance with Russia because Russia is a supporter of Serbia's position on Kosovo, rejecting Kosovo's independence. On the other hand, Serbia is quite reliant, again, like Asmed said, on Russian gas and in Russian investment. On the other hand, Serbia is part of the European community. It is far away from Russia. It is surrounded by NATO and EU members all around it. So it has to also balance between its EU interests, and Serbia is a EU candidate country. So on the one hand, you have this emotional support for Russia. On the other hand, you have this pragmatic, what are we going to do if we are isolated? So Serbia, its official position has been, it first tried to be ambiguous, but then after being pushed by the great powers, it seems to have taken a very delicate position in the sense that it has first claimed that it did not want to condemn Russian intervention in Ukraine, and it refused to impose EU sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, it from the get-go proclaimed that it upholds Ukrainian territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity, and refused to recognize the breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. So there has been a bit of a flip-flop in Serbia's position. The government has said that we are no longer operating in an international law order. We are operating in international norms order. In an international norms order, big powers win and small powers just have to survive. We have to stay steadfast to our commitment to international law, partly because our strategic interest is to still keep the issue of Kosovo alive. So it is a very difficult position. The public is very divided. On the one hand, I would say that the majority is pro-Russian and is in support of the government not imposing sanctions on Russia. Flights still are continuous between Moscow and Belgrade. There's a lot of media support for Russia, but the official position is one where Serbia has joined the UN resolution condemning Russian intervention in Ukraine, calling for Russia to remove its troops and stop the conflict. So it's in a very difficult position. I think Serbia, a lot of academics in Serbia claim that for a long time Serbia has been, for the last 10 years, trying to kind of take the traditional Yugoslav position of non-alliance neutrality, the third way, if you will, but that works in a bipolar system. What we are looking at now is a very multipolar world. I think the perspective is a multipolar world. In a multipolar world, the threat to security and survival for small states is extremely, extremely precarious.
Vadim, may I just jump in, if I may?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting what Uroš said. I had taken down a note. I mean, this is one of the arguments that countries like Sweden or Finland are also saying: neutrality at war and non-alignment at peace, at times of peace. But that is even, you know, it's like a very much of a Star Wars situation. You're either with me or against me kind of a situation, that you cannot have that. But ambiguity is still it's interestingly one of the choices that a lot of countries on the verge, as Sam Huntington would have said, the fault line countries are able to follow in terms of either missing on sort of an important UN resolution. Some countries, they just didn't register to vote. That was their way of like, it's not that I'm voting against or even for or even abstaining. I'm just not there. Let's just conveniently go have some coffee, or, you know, there's a leak in my apartment. You know, the UN ambassador for this country would go there. But that ambiguity is also manifested itself in some countries where officially the government would sanction or would not sanction, either one, but then at a popular social level, you would have the opposite reaction. I mean, one of the best examples is Georgia, where the government decided not to, Republic of Georgia, to not support or support the sanctions, taking a pro-Russian stance, but, you know, Tbilisi and Georgia, everywhere you have, you know, solidarity flags and symbols with Ukraine. So it is a confusing time, let's call it that. It's sort of like an oil and water when you're mixing it up. It's like being mixed now. It will take a while until the water and the oil separate again.
Yeah, I think for countries like Serbia, like Armenia, like Georgia, smaller countries that have some links with Russia, but also are looking towards the West, whether it's just pure economic interest or there are some norms and values that are shared. I think it's a very tough time. Because you do want to cater to your own population, to the sentiments, but at the same time, you know that in the greater context, you're asked to take a side, and usually that side sometimes is not popular with popular opinion.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so Armenia was one of the countries which abstained the March 2nd U.S. General Assembly voting, which adopted a resolution demanding that Russia immediately and completely withdraw of all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. So Armenia's situation, which is the main topic of today's discussion, is quite delicate. For a number of reasons. First of all, its strategic partner, Russia, has invaded a sovereign country. Armenia and Russia are in the same security treaty organization, and Russia may invoke the respective article of that. Armenians on both sides are fighting, and if we believe Putin, who in 2015 announced that there are 3 million Armenians living in Russia, and according to different data, there are around 400 to 500 Armenians living in Ukraine. So it's rather painful to see the names of, among other names, Ukrainians, Russians, and many among other names, to see Armenian surnames appearing. We understand that we are also seeing that Armenians on the one side are fighting against the others, perhaps killing others. So that's a third layer of a problem that we observe. How can the Russian military operation in Ukraine, or war in Ukraine, impact its military personnel in Armenian Artsakh? The other level of questions is how Russia is being sidelined and cut off from the global economic transactions and deals impact Armenia, and also. Although Ukraine and Armenia were at odds on several key questions as Ukraine backed Azerbaijan, however, Ukraine was one of Armenia's top trade partners, especially in terms of importing from Ukraine. So consumer prices hiked in Armenia, and I wanna know, Aspet, perhaps you want to go. How do you explain at this point in time of the 19 days, what have been the major implications of the war on Armenia, and how is the war impacting Armenia's security, economy, and development strategies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good intro and background that you provided, but It's quite interesting. As you were saying that, I couldn't stop but thinking about so many instances about being a global nation where you might end up being in two neighboring countries. And, because of conscription, because of war, you would end up seeing, Armenians fighting other Armenians in their respective armies, going back to Russian versus Ottoman wars, as, one of the brighter examples that comes to mind is Lebanon war, where Syrian Armenians serving in the Syrian army were bombing Armenian populated areas in Lebanon. But regardless of that, there is the element of both short and long-term sort of, benefits and side effects. I'm not sure about whether or not the law of diminishing returns would work here, meaning the longer it would go, the benefits that Armenia would get less and less. But a couple of quick observations. Armenia is not part of the sanctions. And interestingly enough, for those of you who are around, and you can see so many Russians coming here, mostly digital nomads. They come here for 2, 3, 4, 5 months. We had a couple of days ago, there was a warning, not a warning, but an alert from the U.S. Embassy that there is not enough housing here. Consumer prices, as Varam mentioned, are going up. Now, the closest that comes to my mind now is the analogy that was made, that happened, or the thing that happened in 2015-16 with Belarus. Within a single year, Belarus ended up being the top importer and exporter of frozen fish. Before that, it was not even on the radar. But after 2015, at the Crimea War, suddenly, actually, it was used as a backdoor to import fish and then sell it to Russia or export it to Russia. Something like this at different levels has happened in Armenia, but the magnitude, it's one of the things about the magnitude. So those who are well situated, be that landlords or consumer or markets and so on, they will benefit in the short run. In terms of a longer term or midterm, probably Armenia might end up being a backdoor for Russian for importing or exporting Russian or even financial transaction. But here's my main concern. What if, in that context, the West decides that it's okay to have 3 million or 2.5 million collateral damage, and knowing what's happening, they extend the sanctions on Armenia. This hasn't happened before, but this kind of an action hasn't happened before, but neither has this kind of a war where Russia, Ukraine, and the West have been facing off in such intensity and in such ferocity since probably, I would even say, the Berlin crisis. Maybe that must have been the last time where we had such a sort of standoff. So short term, I think consumer prices are going up. The Armenian currency is devaluated, its attachment to rubles. But don't forget about the remittances. That's also going to go down. Okay, so that could have an adverse impact. On the plus side, as I said, Armenia can act as a backdoor for trade with Russia, but it all depends on the breadth, on the temporal component. Again, when you're analyzing these short versus long terms, if the war even to stop now, I don't think the sanctions would be removed immediately. So, so from this perspective, I think there is an opportunity for Armenia to navigate. But as I have said this before in other contexts, the problem is, does Armenia have the software and the hardware to be able to do that? The software meaning the strategic thinking, walking a fine line, and the hardware meaning the people in terms of especially foreign policy and active foreign policy. This is perhaps one of the instances where small states, something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last semester and 20 years ago as well, but is where they have opportunities. This might be an opportunity for them because in this chaos, they can navigate if they have the software and the hardware to be able to navigate better.
Yeah, I would like to kind of draw on that. I've heard the same talk now in Serbia, that Serbia is going to be the IT hub for Moscow. Everyone is coming, flights are full, 30 flights per day, everybody's coming, Russians are coming. The question is, how do you keep these people after the conflict ends, right? These people might rent an Airbnb, they might work as digital nomads, they might they might buy a few loaves of bread and some milk and visit a few restaurants. But when this ends, there has to be some plan to try to motivate these people to keep some type of relationship and connection with either Yerevan or Belgrade, because wars end and people strive to go home. What is the allure for Russians or Ukrainians fleeing this war? What is the allure for them to, when this ends, not to just say, hey, thanks a lot, really enjoyed my time, I'm taking my money, which I've probably saved a lot, and I'm going home and I'm rebuilding my life. Instead of saying, hey, I'm going home, but here's the connections that I'm making with Yerevan. I have a few friends who can work, who can make some connections, who can build something, who can, right? That's the question. And that comes down to, how do our respective governments cater to these people, host them, if you will, and some type of, not, if you will, a positive obligation that these people that we have hosted for God knows how long will one day return a favor back to us, and that's a question for us all.
One observation before we go to the final question for today is the following. So if we look at the number of Ukrainian Armenians who applied for some kind of assistance to return to Armenia is very low, at least what the government tells us. I'm sure there have been a number of cases when many Ukrainian Armenians returned without informing properly the government about their return to Armenia. So what is also interesting, what if the conflict turns upside down and there will be some military operations within the territory of southern Russia? This is a territory where many Armenians live, in Rostov and in Stavropol, in Krasnodar. What if the situation, also the operation, continues in the territory of Crimea, where many Armenians also live? So I don't want to single out the Armenian context by any means, but the Armenian ethnicity. But my point is that in the times of war, again, the Armenian government was caught unprepared on a number of levels. It was in Iraq in the beginning of 2000, and then the Syrian conflict, and now this. And on many levels, I hope that the government of Armenia has a contingency plan so that if there is a need, there can be logistical support for those Armenians who want to come to Armenia, so that they can come to Armenia and get the required support from the Armenian government. Now, going to the final question, then we'll have a Q&A session. I want to ask this question. Uroš, perhaps you can go first, because it concerns a lot to your experience. So how does the Ukrainian case, this war, stand out from the other cases of occupations and invasions for the last 50 years? The Soviet and American occupations of Afghanistan, the US-led NATO interventions in Yugoslavia and Libya, the US occupation of Iraq. So how does this one differ from the other examples that I've just mentioned? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question, but I would say very clearly a lack of legitimacy, right? I think that what we find with all of these interventions is that international law has gone out of the window. The idea of international legality is gone out of the window a long time. 99 in Kosovo with NATO bombing, it was illegal. Yet there was legitimacy. And the West is good at building legitimacy. You know why it's good? Because it pinpoints a phrase and people bandwagon on that phrase, right? Ethnic cleansing, Kosovo. Let's go. It's legitimate. It's not legal, but hey, it's acceptable, right? Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. Hey, who is against taking out weapons of mass destruction? You can't be against that, right? It's international. It's a norm. So I think that the West is very good at creating, and I'm not in any way criticizing the West for this. It is good at building legitimacy. Where Russia has failed, I think, in this media war that I think is very big, overarching issue in this conflict, is that it has failed to build legitimacy, right? You've got several things happening at the same time. You've got the NATO enlargement. You've got issues of de-Russification of Ukraine, which is a big concern for Russia. Russia's denazification of the regime that is creating this de-Russification of Ukraine. So all of these things are kind of coming together, yet Russia has failed to highlight this, to kind of encapsulate it in one thesis statement, if you will. Hey, we're going for this reason. And that has created a lack of international legitimacy. I think that's the big thing that is very different. People say that, you know, this Ukraine conflict is all of a sudden happened. It's very unexpected. I mean, if you look at the literature in political science from the 1990s, how many dissertations were claiming that Ukraine was forecasting that Ukraine was going to be the first country to either experience a civil war or some other type of conflict that would create a separation of Ukraine. So it's not something new. It's not a shock. What is a shock is, I think, is the lack of legitimacy in creating the momentum for this intervention. And that is something that was very different from in 99 with NATO, in Kosovo, in Bosnia also before that in the early 1990s. Libya also, right? Arab Spring, democracy. Who is against democracy, right? But now it's like, well, you know, it's the first war. It will be a third world war. Yet we were never concerned with the same in Syria. Syria has been going on for a long, long time. Various ethnic groups in conflict. Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so I think for many people, we like to compartmentalize things. We like to have that one phrase that we're going for, right? That our goal is this. And in this conflict, we don't see that. A lot of different words are thrown out, yet it's very unclear. The messaging is unclear, and that makes people uneasy. So on that hand, a second thing, yes, I think is just this idea, as I said, is that for the first time, right, we're clearly doing without international law. We're talking about norms, and norms are different for different cultures. So it's such a tragic conflict.
All right, thank you. Aspet, you have like very short.
Yeah, very, very short. I think one of the problems is that with the end of the Cold War, and again, you know, a lot of people, and I have to have that disclaimer that this is all in hindsight. It's not that I'm making any discovery, but obviously I'm seeing what's happening now and, you know, looking at the longer sort of longer trajectory of things. But the world, the West especially, started dismantling the international system that existed on basis of bipolarity. The problem is, well, many problems, but one of the problems is that it wasn't replaced with anything else. While Europe has tried not to poke Russia a lot in terms of being more conciliatory and whatnot, the US under different administration has actually ended up expanding and poking and sort of pushing it to the limit. Now, I think one of the things about international relations, I think we were talking about this earlier, is that in rational theory or in realism even, you know, there's the approach that leaders are base their decision on rational choice, and war is the least rational component unless it is a rational choice to go to war. And for me, probably the million-dollar question is, has Putin, in his decision to start a war, is it based on any rational decision, or are we seeing the unhinged sort of approach? Because again, there are a lot of indicators that, you know, the war is not going as planned. A lot of officers have been sacked, and so on and so forth. So it's also important to think about this as to how it can end as well. You know, because if you go to the point of no return, we're not there yet. I think there might be, if there is an honest dealer, it might be possible to find a gradual de-escalation, but it also depends on what is the mindset. in Washington or in Moscow or in Berlin or in London or in Beijing. I mean, no one is talking about that, but I think that is a huge component as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Uroš and Aspet. Now, there are questions which are coming in. So let me start with the first question that has been one of the most often raised questions for the past couple of weeks. And that is asked by Artashes. He is asking the following question: why the information war of this war is completely different and biased in comparison to the Libyan, Syrian, and Nagorno-Karabakh wars, particularly in Armenia. He continues, the sentiment is getting anti-Ukrainian or soft stance to Russia just because there's so much support coming from the West, when in the case of Turkish, Azerbaijani fans, the Armenians heard only the voices of concerns and appeals for quick ceasefire. So what is your take about these different approaches to information war in this war?
I think the issue is that it's biased depending on what you're watching. The problem with the information war, and this has been proven actually, it's not as intense as everyone expected it to be. Actually, if anything, when it came to the hybrid warfare that is going on, it's amazingly surprising that the level of the engagement is not as much as people expected it. Actually, the Ukrainian government Minister of Information actually has been quite active in, making. Just today, I saw, a doctored sort of video about Paris being attacked by Russians, made by Ukrainians, to actually draw it close to home for the French and whatnot. But we follow. This is a common problem for all of us. We insulate ourselves and follow news that agree more with ourselves, with us. So the perception, especially in the case of Armenia, and this is one of the unfortunate situations, I think, here, is that there is the prism that this war and this conflict is being viewed as, is that what was the position of Russia and what was the position of Ukraine during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, right? So it comes down to, it's a myopic perspective. And a lot of the information, a lot of the anti-Ukrainian sentiments, or if there are, as was mentioned by the question, is because of that. It's because of that. I personally, again, with my limited sort of exposure, I would say there's usually more apathy here than anywhere else I have been in the last 2 weeks. And I've been to about 4 countries in the last 2 weeks. And this is probably the most apathetic, or the most sort of the most apathetic collectively. I'm not saying everyone is about the war. They're quite passive about this, except on social media, where everyone becomes a hashtag activist.
Yeah, I think, from both of our countries, Serbia and Armenia, we've gone through wars, right? It is for us, it is old news rehashed, right? And life goes on. Life goes on. And so for us to see one more war, it's pretty much, hey, okay, we've done this, we've been here, we kind of understand you, but we're also kind of have a thick skin now, and we find our own survival in everything, right? Whereas for the West, right, it's a huge for them. It's an emotional sentiment, right? For them, the war is not a legitimate way of solving disputes. For us, it's just one of the...
Well, we're still licking our wounds, right? Right, I mean, Armenia more so than...
We're unhappy that others have not come to our aid to provide us with emotional support. Why should we support and provide emotional comfort to others now, right? We are still thinking about ourselves. So in that way, but I agree with my colleague Aspet here that we have never more do we have avenues for news. Never more do we seen a different spectrum of news media. Yet we kind of choose only that kind of solidifies our position. We feel good about it, right? We live in our own comfort zone, and we can either watch RT all day, or we can watch CNN all day because, hey, everybody else is, the conspirator out there. And so it's hard, right? When we had general broadcasting, then you heard the wide spectrum. Now you can just turn off everything and just follow your own little
Okay, thank you. I'm going to through all the questions. I guess the question from Elitsa has been already answered. she was asking how about should we be happy about the arrival of Russians? Would it help the local economy? I guess you guys have answered that question, so let me move on. Marina is having the following remark, that because of spreading democracy sounds much better than spreading the socialism. However, the result remains the same. It's war. We all live in illusion. This is Marina's remark. Now, Haika Satirian asks the following question. Quick note, Russian TV channels and media are getting taken off the air and throttled in the information space. Meanwhile, pro-Ukrainian propagandists are running rampant in the Western media sphere. How would you even push your own narrative in this situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's nothing new, right? What's happening in Russia, the media control or the government control over the media has always been an issue. But I have to say one thing, that having lived in several countries which have had authoritarian system where censorship has always been there, there's always a way to get around it. I'm talking about like really good authoritarian, typical, very good classic authoritarian regimes where they would sort of suppress and whatnot. Nowadays, whenever you get a call from someone living in Russia, the first thing they would say is that before even speak, they would say, that we can get 15 years in prison, meaning just shut the hell up, don't talk about politics because everyone's listening. Now, that having said that, one of the key components here is the no rules. When even Uroš, with his sort of pessimism or hesitation and cynicism about international law norms and so on, at least there is some element of norm when it comes to international conduct. But when it comes to information warfare, information dissemination, it's beyond the Wild West. It's uncharted territory. There is no control. And the problem is, the best possible option to stop that from happening is sort of literacy, digital literacy, where you actually know. There's so many videos out there. Steven Seagal is in the jungles fighting with the Russians against Ukraine. He's like, the guy is like probably barely is able to walk now. I mean, to all respect to anyone who likes Steven Seagal, but I mean, this is the place that at some point you could have Photoshop photos, and you might question it. But now even with videos, and it's such a large environment, a big environment, uncharted, that I don't think there is anything you can do except insulate yourself.
Yeah, I think even if Arab Spring couldn't prevent free media in a way, I mean, from all of these different positions coming out, I think that I don't think it's such a big concern in this conflict either. Right. I think that you can't prevent a viewpoint anymore from coming out. I think that's the same in Russia. Yes, sure, a few news stations might have been put off the air, but there is a lot of underground activity. And to be honest with you, that underground activity is much more powerful than the 2 news stations or 3 news stations that you pull off the air. So I think for Russia, the threat is from the underground, from the bottom up, civil society sharing information. This is when things become dangerous and much more powerful in creating momentum for change in Russia also.
Thank you, Uroš. Now let's go to the question that Hovhannes Gojabasyan has asked. In one of his Q&As, Vladimir Putin said that NATO lied them when they promised Russia that there will be no expansion to its borders. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? If possible, bring 3 reasons why yes and why not. Thank you.
Boy, very to the point, and it's not just about the promises. There have been cases about expansion. I'm not going to go into the technicality. Technically, they didn't expand, or technically they expand. But in international relations, actions, sometimes as important as actions, are perceptions about actions.
Yes.
It's not just because NATO expanded. I think there have been a lot of scholars talking about this. I'm refraining myself from arguing whether or not the West is the one that pushed the limit too much or not. I have a sense that it is, but I still haven't observed it. I still haven't studied it. But it's not, doesn't matter whether or not they stayed there. I think from the perspective of Russia, it is a perception that it is expanding. Ukraine was never going to be part of NATO. Just like Georgia is not going to be part of NATO. I think they knew about it. The problem here, I think one thing that I have to agree in terms of, or put a blame on the West, is that the West has rarely been clear about its intentions to countries like Ukraine and Georgia. They actually gave them more importance than they actually have. Yeah. And that drove Georgia to 2008. That drove Ukraine recently in the last 4 or 5 years. And we could see the articulation of that with the Ukrainian president, expressing his dismay about why NATO not doing anything. So if it's just about observing the fact, if really NATO had expanded to Ukraine, you could see now NATO fighters over the skies of Ukraine. But they are restraining. I mean, this is the thing. This is not unleashed yet, unfortunately. Fortunately, it's not unleashed yet. And unfortunately, if it's not unleashed, and it's this of a clusterfuck, let's call it, for censorship. I think it's just mind-boggling and scary to think what could have happened if it was really, really what it was. I mean, this is the thing, and it goes back to one of the last things I said, right? In terms of really what is going on in the minds of Russian policymakers. The impression of paranoia. I mean, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people are not out there to get you. So.
I think, we always think of NATO as just the force, the hard power, the military power. I think NATO's real influence, if you will, is this socialization aspect. I think a lot in the East are caught off guard. I will tell you that Serbia was quite caught off guard when NATO was making, and there was flirtations between Serbia and NATO. One of the big things that came out, I remember this very clearly, was when NATO officials came over and said, listen, for us, one of the main things of you trying Serbia being part of NATO is for you to demilitarize your military, make it part of society. Right? You can't have military offices in the center of the city. You've got to take them out of the city. Your military personnel cannot be walking around city streets in their full uniforms. They have to go out in civilian uniforms. They have to be part of the people. They're serving the people. For Serbia, that was a huge, it was like, what the hell, right? For us, the uniform is number one. Right? When the uniform is on the street, you bow to the uniform. It was a huge thing. I think that for the Russians, if there is something that how NATO was expanding in Ukraine, it was this totally different perspective on how you understand and view your military. What are the norms? What are the ideals that your military should be espousing? What are its primary aims and objectives, right? NATO, totally different. It's a socialization effort, more so than a military pact.
Other than socialization, Urosh, I think the conversation brings conversation, but it's the other thing is that the element of the bureaucracy, it's truly a Max Weberian component of how bureaucracy becomes an animal that becomes self-perpetuating. And I think this is also the reason why NATO remained, in the last 20, 30 years. It's because it's too much bureaucracy for it to fail, too big to fail. It had become self-purpose. They reappropriated a bit. It became an auxiliary wing of the UN, and they operated under the UN and so on. But, it's like everyone, a lot of people now, they would say, they've been saying Russia is this or that, and they say, see, we told you so. Well, if you live long enough and you speak long enough, but it's bound that some of the things you say will come true. It doesn't mean that it is true. But, and a lot of people back then also talked about NATO is relevant. It's going to be relevant about this and that. And now with the conflict now, see, we told you, this is why NATO wasn't dismantled, as if they knew that this was going to happen. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Okay, let's move on to like a few other questions. But one thing that I want to second us, but that one of the implications of this war, we already can claim that Putin helped NATO to reinvent itself, to acquire a new meaning in this global order. Now, There's a question from Shari. Shari wants us to focus on the main topic, and that is what are the short and long-term possible impacts on Armenia sanction? I mean, possible impacts of sanctions on Armenia.
On Russian side.
Yeah, the Russian sanctions. What are the possible short and long-term impacts on Armenia? So,
well, the short term is, I think, as we talked about, right? It's about the digital nomads. It's about the injection of capital. I wouldn't be surprised even, banking services actually, getting their share from currency transfers and so on and so forth. But that is the short term. I think it's going to also consumer prices going up. That's going to have a negative impact on the local on the population here in Armenia. That's the short term, short to midterm. But anything beyond that, it's about that nimbleness, right? It's about being nimble, flexible, which Armenia is not, even though it is very well situated to be economically adjustable and economically flexible. That where do you situate yourself in this long term? It's a strategic vision as to, can you act as a backdoor for Russia? Can you actually be an intermediary? I'm not talking about, being Armenia coming in and becoming, a negotiator between Russia and the West and so on. That's far, far beyond, as much as some people would like to see that, it's far beyond any capacity that Armenia would have. So short term, I think, again, I hate to do this, but if it's a simple, math or a simple sort of a ledger, I would say short term, it is going to be plus overall, a black sort of ledger. The pluses are going to be more than the minuses, but long term, it all depends whether or not the sanctions would blanket and include Armenia and or Georgia and other countries, Belarus as well.
I'm curious to see what happens, because I think that Yerevan specifically is going through gentrification. I would be curious to see if this continues, what would be the implications for Yerevan as a city, the gentrification of certain neighborhoods, because we see it vividly at the moment, right? With the most recent influx of mainly Western Armenians who came post the tragedies in Syria and Lebanon. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on that in years.
That's long term, Urosh. I think that would be the long term, because gentrification occurs over a long period of time.
Yeah,
right?
of course, yeah.
Okay, there is a question from Lilith Kizlarian. I guess this question for Urosh. Urosh, are there any talks or fears how this war might affect the Balkan conflict or shadow the peace that has been achieved in the region in the past decades? I am interested both in the sentiments of the Serbian society and the government discourse.
You know what? I think in the Balkan context, the peace that is current is fragile. It's very fragile. I think for a long time there has been talk that this is not the peace that is in the former Yugoslavia is not a lasting peace, that there will be further events, whether it will be conflict, but there will be struggles. Yes, definitely for Serbia, the concern is very much that if Russia loses this conflict, that we do not have a political ally, that we're going to have to reframe our foreign policy. So in that sense, yes, I think Serbians are concerned that its historical ally we might lose a historical ally. The second is that for a long time we have the Balkans used to be a focus in the 90s. Then we were thankful in the 2000s that the Balkans were out of the news. But now I think that the concern in Serbia and in the rest of the Balkans is that we are going to be low priority, whether for Russia or for the European Union. I think they're going to focus their energies, their economic strengths, their political focus is going to be heavily on much towards Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic states, but the Balkans are going to be a low priority item. And that for me is a big concern, because when the big powers are defocused, we in the Balkans like to do our own thing, and our thing sometimes isn't very nice. So I think that's a concern. But definitely, if you think that it's the peace that is current is unstable, immediately after the next day after Russia had intervened in Ukraine, the Kosovo prime minister came out and said that Serbia is definitely going to invade Kosovo, and we are going to stand up like the Ukrainians have stood up to the Russians, immediately boiling these tensions, right, on a regional level, which I think are unwarranted.
Thank you, Uroš. Now, Ida Yolchan is asking the following question. Do you think it is the best option for Armenia to stay neutral in Russia-Ukraine conflict? Is it economically and politically beneficial for Armenia?
I would say that I don't think that the neutrality is going to be a sustainable option in the long term. Big powers want you to take a position. So I think Armenia for now has had the luxury of being neutral. I don't know how long that will be sustainable. Again, neutrality doesn't mean ambiguity, people, right? Israel has been a champion of strategic ambiguity. Armenia doesn't have the luxury of ambiguity. Neutrality is a position that will have to change at some point, whether of its own volition or it will be forced into that position. But I don't think I think that like Serbia tried neutrality for a few days, it was forced to take a stance, albeit a rather delicate stance, but one that nevertheless had to be made.
Okay, just Jiraj Dilan is asking a question. Why elaborating on implications on Armenia, the speakers didn't mention implication on the situation around Artsakh? So would you like to elaborate us, but perhaps while answering to that question, perhaps you have points to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have anything to add. I mean, Uroš put it elegantly. But in terms of the issue of Artsakh, I think this is something that, everything is interconnected. But just because everything is interconnected doesn't mean that you have to look for sort of ties where there are none. But obviously, the impact is there. But, don't forget that Azerbaijan signed an agreement of alliance with Russia a couple of days before the whole the storm started. But at the same time, don't forget that the Russian peacemakers are still quite active in terms of the delimitation and whatnot on the border. So on the line of contact. So I think at this point, I'm not sure that there will be any flare up per se on that front, because there are so many. This is small peanut for everyone. Russia, Turkey, and so on and so forth. And within this context, I mean, I think one of the problems here is that there are so many pieces of the puzzle that we're not seeing to be able to see the larger picture. Is like countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, are sort of, for instance, they're all sort of holding onto the edge of their seat, figuring out what China will do, right? Yeah. And no one knows what China's going to do. That's in that context. Does Armenia have the means to be able to really do anything? What Uroš was talking about, ambiguity and neutrality and so on. You can't. Armenia doesn't have either. It doesn't have an ability to be ambiguous nor neutral, especially after the 2020 war. So in that context, I think, as it has been for the last 2 years, Armenia is in the driver's side seat, and the passenger seat, and they're not able to do much. It just has to wait and ride this sort of wave.
So Zare Asadarian has asked the question about, again, Russians into Armenia and how Armenian government, what policy should the Armenian government to implement to keep them? I guess to some extent that question was answered by Uroš. Then we have a question about NATO. Why do you think NATO didn't dissolve itself after 1991? What's the reason for NATO to exist?
As young as I was, I remember perfectly the debate about that. There was a huge debate about that, whether or not there is a point of NATO or not. A lot of people argued about the humanitarian nature of NATO that it could take. Others argued that, you know, an institution and an organization that has existed for, as I said, about the Weberian sort of Max Weberian approach, that it had a bureaucracy too big to fail. I don't think they could have dismantled. You know, just like when we're seeing that the institutions, bigger institutions in the Soviet Union have not disintegrated. They just changed names, but the bureaucracy is the same. So I don't think NATO was going to go anywhere. As I said, I mean, in Kosovo, in Yugoslavia, you know, in Bosnia Herzegovina, they played a role under the auspices of the UN and so on in other places. But again, I do not see. This is a course I'm teaching about this semester about international organization. One of the things is that, if anything, they are more relevant now. It's the functionality of NATO. NATO has become more functional, slightly dysfunctional, functional sort of organization. So I think it's here to stay, and it's multilateralism. It's the West's response to Russian sort of push, and it's the West's multilateral response. Let's quote.
You know, Trump was big on the whole thing that, you know, the NATO has a free rider problem, that the U.S. contributes so much more than every other country. What's for NATO? Well, here you go. Problem solved now. I don't think we're going to have a free rider problem in some time to come. So that point is mute. But again,
probably a lot of blank checks are coming into Brussels from the Baltics and Poland and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I think again, it's the socialization element. It is just, you know, NATO. When you say NATO, it's a brand, and brand loyalty carries a lot. Yeah.
Okay. So. We have a few more questions. We have to finish this discussion at 7:45, so we have 12 minutes. So the other interesting question is about, this question is from Jim McGee. The question is, any impact of the conflict on Armenia's discussion with Turkey to normalize relations? And the second question he has, any role of the conflict or increase in activity of the Russian military base near Gyumri?
Not about the second one. Again, I personally haven't followed Vadim. If you did, you can answer that. But I think this is, if anything, this will give more impetus and more sort of push for the Turkish-Armenian normalization process. You know, in terms of just like wrapping it up, kind of a situation. I'm not saying that it's going to be beneficial. Who's it going to be beneficial for? But it is something that it can continue behind the scenes, and again, with a lack of any interest from Russia nor from the West in terms of, you know, pulling strings on this. But I think it would have a positive impact on normalization between Armenia and Turkey. Mind you, I'm not saying that I think it's a positive thing. I'm just saying it will have a positive impact on the normalization.
All right, so we have 2 questions from Marina. Thank you, Marina, for being very active. You have sent already the 3rd question. But the question that Marina is asking is also interesting, that since the start of the onslaught, one of the interesting questions in the international relations has become whether China will invade Taiwan. So yet again, Marina is asking the question, so what do you think?
I'm not a China expert, but this is a real issue, right? They've been expressing it. South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they are actually on high alert, even to the extent that actually Japan was thinking of allowing American nuclear presence, you know, deployment of American nuclear missiles in Japan as a protection and so on. I think China is more we said that about Russia as well up until like a couple of weeks ago. But China's foreign policy is less rash. It's less sort of reactive. I don't think they would take on. I think they might provoke, but not necessarily engage in full and Taiwan invasion. But that's my 2 cents about this.
Uroš, I'm sorry. Brent also had a question, perhaps connected. He was asking, will this conflict also affect Armenia's interactions with China? If so, how? Perhaps you may want to tie these two answers.
Take it, Uroš.
Take it. Well, I think that the Chinese definitely see this as a learning experience, what is happening with Russia and Ukraine, right? How is the West engaging with the Russians? How far can the Russians take this? Definitely, they're surely not sleeping. I saw today that apparently the Chinese and the Russians were talking about the Chinese giving some type of military aid and assistance to the Russians, and the Americans were very, very categorical that would lead into a different dispute with the Americans and the Chinese. So I bet that the Americans are concerned. I do think, as Aspet has said, I think that maybe maybe the Chinese leadership is a little less rash. I think also Putin has kind of creating through this process a legacy, but there is a lot of momentum behind it. Whereas for the Chinese, still the leadership is it's grappling with a number of different issues. I don't see the Taiwan thing developing very quickly. But yes, of course, the Chinese are always trying to press the buttons and seeing where things land. What do I think about Armenia-China relations? I'm not sure, but I can tell you that Serbia-China relations are heightened now, because we fear that if the Russians are out of the game in the Balkans, that we need somebody to counter the Western influence, and that will definitely be the Chinese. So I think that my perspective is for you. Well, you know what, Aspet, you're better on the Armenian stuff.
No, nothing to add, Uroš.
All right, so just from now on, I'll just ask questions to each, either Aspet or Uroš, because I know your areas of expertise. So I would appreciate if your answers are short and concise. So Anna Ayvazyan is asking a question: what would be the most probable point of no return in this war for either side? Aspet, can you please take that question?
Oh, the point of no return in in the war? Is that the question?
Yes.
I think Russia taking Kiev and continuing. I think if it goes beyond or even occupation of Kiev is the point of no return. I feel that we are very, very close to that point. On the Western side, I think there are more constraints. I think Russia might get to the point of no return sooner than the West. But I wouldn't be surprised if countries like Poland and Romania, along with Moldova and so on, to start actively sending troops or so-called volunteers. That would quickly, devolve. The whole thing would devolve into, a major sort of an abyss from which it's impossible to get back.
Okay. Now, Hovannes and David Nanigian is asking a following question. If the war really escalates, do you think that Russia may withdraw the peacekeeping troops from the Artsakh region? Uroš, what do you think?
No, I don't think. I don't think it will. It would withdraw its troops. I think that. Russia has committed a sizable portion of troops to Ukraine, but there is a lot more troops. We can't forget, at least we believe there was a lot of data that the Russians are the strongest on the ground, right? That's why they have opted for a ground intervention rather than an aerial intervention. I think that the portion of troops that they're keeping in Artsakh it won't change in the bigger cup. So I don't think that will be a.
Okay, Uroš, perhaps this question is better for you. Azari Giragosyan is asking, what happened to the Budapest Agreement of 1993 when Russia, USA, and UK guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity?
You know what? I don't know. I would have to maybe Aspet.
It's okay to say. It's okay to say I don't know.
I don't know.
In these times of uncertainty, I guess it's quite It's also an honest answer because there's too much going on. But we have question from a second question from Hovhannes Kojabashan. Do you think the exacerbation in the borders of Artsakh and Armenia are conditioned with the Russia-Ukraine conflict? And do you think there may be escalation in the borders of Armenia and Artsakh? This question comes from really what's going on for the past couple of days in Artsakh, and this is quite a pertinent question. Asbjørn, would you like to take this question?
I think we're
yes.
in a situation where you have you do have every single opportunity counts, and every single opportunity you have to take. And in the context, as I said, this sort of messy situation where the eyes of the world are not focused on small peanuts like Artsakh. I think it is possible, but I don't think it would escalate. Even okay, I'm not going to be saying this definitively, but Azerbaijan has a lot to digest since the war. I mean, they haven't been able to, they're in no position to start another war. I would say, I think they haven't solidified, they haven't sort of digested, if you want to call it, their gains from the war. So I'm, if you can call it that, I'm optimistic that it won't happen. It won't escalate.
Just let us also conclude. I have some concluding remarks and some general observations. First of all, I want to thank all the participants for their questions and for their active engagement in this discussion. Second point I want to make is what happened during the last few days in Antalya, the statements coming from Armenia's foreign minister and Turkish foreign minister. What we heard today when Azerbaijan has presented 5 preconditions to Armenia and how Armenians have responded to this, we see that there is a process, quite expedited process going on currently. And I think there is a process indicating that some circles in this region want to see the Turkish-Armenian and Turkish-Azerbaijani process to be fastened and to be put on a different track. And what extent are they related to the conflict in Artsakh and to Ukraine? It remains to be seen. But what is interesting that Azerbaijani armed forces are currently trying to focus on those key strategic villages that are important. And if there is an opportune moment, and if Russian peacekeepers are not doing their job, or there's some behind-the-door agreement, if Azerbaijan takes control of some of these key strategic positions, that may also be an indication that some behind-the-doors deals are happening. So I don't want to sound speculative, but I think that these kind of questions about possible impact and implications and effects of the Ukrainian conflict can have on Artsakh is quite pertinent. And what is also happening, in addition to what Asbjørn said, the messages coming from some American and European circles that the West should diversify its energy resources, in addition to Qatar, Iran, Venezuela. Now they're also talking about increasing the volume of exports from Azerbaijan. So in line with this, in this wider context, we see that for some countries, for some nations, war is a tragedy. It's pain, it's chaos. But for other countries, it's a time for benefits. So this is what also the situation that we have found ourselves. We can also make just a general conclusion. So I want to thank everyone, and I see there were some questions about Armenia-Turkey relations. Let's hope that in the coming weeks we can also organize such a webinar on Armenia-Turkey relations. and we can share our insights about the current developments on this regard too. All right,
Thank you, Vadim.
I want
Thank
to
you,
thank
Uroš.
you very much, Aspet. Thank you, Uroš. Thank you, all the participants. All the best.
Thank you, guys.